Have you ever heard of a battle so colossal, so utterly devastating, that it didn't just decide the fate of a war, but shattered entire empires and redrew the map of the world? Today, we're diving into the heart of one of history's most brutal and decisive conflicts, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the ultimate turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. So, buckle up, because we're about to journey back to the frozen, war-torn streets of a city that became a symbol of both human suffering and unbreakable will. To understand Stalingrad, we first need to understand Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. His goal was ambitious, to say the least: to conquer the vast territory, seize its resources, and crush communism in a matter of months. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, was at the peak of its power. They employed a tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war, using fast-moving tanks and coordinated air support to punch through enemy lines and encircle huge numbers of Soviet troops. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, capturing city after city, and inflicted staggering losses on the Red Army. By the autumn of 1941, they were at the gates of Moscow. But the brutal Russian winter, combined with fierce Soviet resistance, ground their advance to a halt. So, in the summer of 1942, Hitler changed his strategy. Instead of another direct assault on Moscow, he launched a new offensive in the south, codenamed Case Blue. The primary objective was to capture the rich oil fields of the Caucasus region. This oil was the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine, and without it, their tanks and planes would be useless. But on the way to the Caucasus, one city stood in the path of the German Sixth Army, one of the most elite formations in the Wehrmacht. That city was Stalingrad. Named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, it was a major industrial hub stretching for miles along the western bank of the Volga River. For Stalin, the order was equally clear: Stalingrad must be held at any cost. The city's name became a rallying cry. Not one step back was the command. In late August 1942, the German assault began. The initial attack was a terrifying display of air power. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, dropped thousands of bombs on Stalingrad, turning the city into a sea of fire and rubble. Over 40,000 civilians died in the first week of bombing alone. The Germans expected the defenders to break and flee. They were wrong. The Red Army, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, dug in. They realized something crucial: the ruins of the city were their greatest advantage. The piles of rubble, the skeletal remains of factories, the shattered apartment blocks, they all became fortresses. This was the birth of a new kind of urban warfare. Chuikov's strategy was simple but brutal: hug the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to stay as close to the German lines as possible, sometimes just a grade's throw away. This made it impossible for the Germans to use their superior air power and artillery without risking hitting their own men. The fighting devolved into a savage, close-quarters struggle. Imagine this: Every street, every building, every single room was a battlefield. Soldiers fought with machine guns, grenades, flamethrowers, and even knives and shovels. The Germans called this Rattenkrieg or Rat War. They would clear a room only to have Soviet soldiers pop up from the sewers or through holes in the walls. A single apartment building could change hands a dozen times in a day. The main grain elevator, a massive concrete structure, was defended by a handful of Soviet soldiers for days against relentless German assaults. Mamayev Kurgan, a large hill overlooking the city, became a place of unimaginable carnage. Control of the hill was so fiercely contested that it was said to be riddled with between 500 and 1,250 pieces of metal shrapnel per square meter. The life expectancy of a new soldier arriving at the front line was often less than 24 hours. And all the while, civilians, women, children, the elderly were trapped in this hellscape, starving, freezing, and trying to survive in cellars and basements as the world collapsed around them. While the desperate battle raged within the city, the Soviet High Command was preparing a masterstroke. General Georgy Zhukov, one of the finest military minds of the war, was planning a massive counteroffensive. He knew the German Sixth Army was completely focused on taking Stalingrad. He also knew that the flanks of the German advance, stretching for miles across the open steppe, were held by their less equipped and less motivated allies Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. Zhukov's plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was daring. He would secretly build up to massive Soviet armies on these weak flanks. Then, on November 19, 1942, in the middle of a raging blizzard, the trap was sprung. Soviet tanks and infantry smashed through the Romanian lines to the north and south of Stalingrad. The Allied troops, unprepared and overwhelmed, quickly collapsed. Within just for days, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalik, about 70 miles west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army, around 300,000 men, was completely surrounded. The hunters had become the hunted. The commander of the Sixth Army, General Friedrich Paulus, was in shock. He pleaded with Hitler for permission to attempt a breakout. But Hitler, fueled by arrogance and a refusal to admit defeat, forbade it. He promised Paulus that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air. The head of the Air Force, Hermann Goering, boasted that it was possible. It was a fatal lie. An army of that size needed hundreds of tons of supplies every single day: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. The Luftwaffe, hampered by the brutal Russian winter and relentless Soviet anti-aircraft fire, could only deliver a small fraction of what was needed. The situation inside the Kessel, or cauldron, as the Germans called the pocket, became a nightmare. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death in their trenches. Food ran out. They ate their horses, then dogs, cats, and rats. Ammunition became scarce. Frostbite and disease were rampant. Yet, Hitler demanded they fight to the last man. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in December to break through the Soviet encirclement, but it was stopped miles short of its goal. The men in the cauldron could see the flares of the rescue force on the horizon, a glimmer of hope that was quickly extinguished. By January 1943, the end was near. The Soviets launched their final offensive, Operation Ring, to liquidate the pocket. They split the German forces into smaller and smaller pockets. On January 31st, Soviet soldiers stormed the makeshift headquarters of General Paulus in the basement of a department store. Hitler had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal just a day before, a cynical move since no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected him to take his own life. But Paulus chose to live. He surrendered, and with him, the remnants of the once mighty Sixth Army. Of the nearly 300,000 men trapped in the cauldron, only about 91,000 were left to surrender. And of those 91,000, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest perished in Soviet prisoner of war camps. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost was astronomical. Total casualties for both sides are estimated to be around 1 million people, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city of Stalingrad was utterly destroyed. But the impact of the battle was seismic. For Nazi Germany, it was a catastrophic defeat, not just in terms of men and material, but in morale. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The entire German nation went into 3 days of official mourning. From this point on, the Wehrmacht would be on the defensive on the Eastern Front, pushed back relentlessly by the resurgent Red Army all the way to Berlin. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a symbol of incredible sacrifice and a turning point that galvanized the nation. It proved that Hitler could be beaten. The victory gave a massive boost to the morale of the Allied powers across the world, signaling that the tide of the war was finally turning against the Axis. Stalingrad was more than just a battle, it was the crucible where the fate of empires was forged. It broke the back of the German war machine in the East and set the stage for the eventual downfall of the Third Reich. It also solidified the Soviet Union's position as a dominant military power, which would have profound consequences for the post-war world and the Cold War that followed. The story of Stalingrad is a chilling reminder of the horrors of war, but it's also an incredible testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. It's a story of a city that was reduced to rubble, but refused to fall, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic tales from the past. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other historical battles do you think? Change the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.